Space, the final frontier. This is the Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. Its mission to explore the solar system, to seek out new observations and data, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now the host of the Observer's Notebook, Tim Robertson.
Welcome to episode 46 of the Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. I'm Tim Robertson, the host of the podcast, and also the coordinator of the training program within the ALPO. Thank you for downloading and listening. The ALPO collects and analyzes observations of various solar system bodies and associated phenomena, and publishes them in detailed reports in the Journal of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers, also known as the Strolling Astronomer. This podcast depends upon donations from you, our listeners, to keep it alive. If you enjoy what you hear on the podcast, you can donate to it via Patreon. If you give as little as $1 a month, or even feel more generous, for $5 you receive early access to the podcast before it goes public. For a monthly donation of $10, you receive a copy of the Novice Observer's Handbook, and for $35 a month, you receive producer credits on the podcast, and also 1 year's membership to the ALPO. You can help us out by going to www.patreon, that's patreon.com/observersnotebook. And you can also join the ALPO for as little as $14 a year. You can visit us on the internet at www.alpo-astronomy.org. And we're also on the Facebook. Just search for ALPO Astronomy and you get the official ALPO Facebook page. And also this podcast has a Facebook page as well. Just search for Observer's Notebook. And if you enjoy what you hear on the podcast, please subscribe. That way you'll never miss an episode of the podcast. In this edition, I just returned from the Riverside Telescope Makers Conference up in Big Bear, California, and I had a wonderful opportunity to speak to Bob Stevens. He is past treasurer of the RTMC, and he's also president and CFO of More Data Incorporated. It's an organization created to manage research grants from NASA and the NSF. He's also been an amateur astronomer for nearly 4 decades and is active in asteroid research and having determined over 700 asteroid light curves, and with over 200 research papers, articles, and announcements to his name. He enjoys traveling the world to experience solar eclipses. His current tally is 16, with 3 annular eclipses, 6 partial solar eclipses, and 16 total lunar eclipses. He's been involved actively in numerous astronomical organizations, including RTMC and the American Amateur Society. Bob is also a recipient of a lot of astronomical awards. So here's my talk with Bob. I hope you enjoy it.
Hello, I'm Bob Stevens. I've been an amateur astronomer for about 45 or so years. Got involved in this hobby because I was getting a degree at Riverside Community College and it needed a science class. I had 3 choices: physics, chemistry, or astronomy. I remembered my high school experience about physics and chemistry, so I figured astronomy was the way to go. And I went to class. Dear Professor Robert Dixon recommended the class that we go to our local astronomical society for extra credit to the star parties and meetings. So I said, sure, I'll do that. And I went and I found out that a friend of mine from high school was a member of the club, Randy Wilcox. So he and I started going out on observing star parties, camping trips, all sorts of things, got involved in the club. Not too long after that, somebody tapped me in the shoulder and says, oh, you need to be president of this club. So,
isn't that the way it happens?
Yes. So I foolishly said yes and agreed to do that for a couple years. And meanwhile, of course, life gets in the way. I started out my career as being an accountant, started up my own business, got married. Astronomy activities waned a little bit in that time period, but I was always kind of interested in research and the science ends of things. But I always stayed with working with the RTMC with Clifford Holmes, who led the RTMC throughout all of these years. And he and I and a whole bunch of other people ran this for the longest time.
Now, when did you get involved with the RTMC?
Well, I went to my first one in 1974.
And it began when?
It began in 1969.
Okay. Right.
The first 4 years was held at Riverside Community College, and then they moved up to the dark mountain site of Camp Isamata in San Jacinto. That's the USC Music Campus. They held it there for 2 years before moving over to Camp Oaks in Big Bear, just outside of Big Bear.
That's where we are right now, and you're celebrating the 50th anniversary.
Right. And I started working in organizing the conference in 75 and 76, and we've been here for the last 45 years.
And you're currently the past president?
I am the, of the RTMC, I'm the past treasurer.
Okay.
Cliff was the, when it was an activity of the Riverside Astronomical Society, he was the director of the RTMC. That goes up to 1989. Then the Riverside Astronomical Society spun it off into a separate entity, and he became the executive director of the RTMC. He was the first one up from 1989 to 1991. Then his health issues forced him to step down, and Steve Edberg became the executive director in 1992.
Yeah, this is like my 35th RTMC I've been to, and I have very fond memories of Cliff in the 90s. I used to bring my young children up here, and whenever he would see him, he'd always come and talk to him and say hi to him, and he really made him feel welcome, and that's, he was an amazing guy.
He was an amazing guy, and, he had all sorts of great tricks. His memory of all the people he had ever met in his lifetime is no better than any of ours. But he would always just come up, shake your hand, and say, "Tell me your name again."
Yeah.
And that was just one of his catchphrases, and people would happily and gladly tell him.
That's true. That's fair. I remember him doing that.
Yeah,
that's very cool. Yeah. Now, I heard a story yesterday that his son actually got him involved with astronomy.
Yes, Travis was, I want to say, 8 years old, and for a Christmas gift, they gave him the starter 60 millimeter refracting telescope on the lousy shaky mount. Mm-hmm. And I think Travis was maybe allowed to use it just once, perhaps. And Cliff immediately shanghaied his telescope, and then eventually and very quickly, evolved into 8-inch telescopes, and then 10 and 12-inch telescopes and everything. In other words, the astronomy bug bit Cliff early and hard.
Yeah, and he was a Twinkie salesman, wasn't he?
Clifford Holmes worked for Twinkies, the local distributor in Riverside, delivering bread and things that you shouldn't be eating to all sorts of stores around the Inland Empire. He actually drove the truck. He would unload the loaves of bread and Twinkies and everything. He would take the orders from the shop owners and would do this, 5 days a week, all day. And then at night he would observe and would so often be out running outreach events. Before we called these things outreach events, he was going anywhere and everywhere to every public park that you can think of, and eventually, of course, created the Riverside Telescope Makers Conference. He was heavily involved in the Western Amateur Astronomers for a time,
right.
And just was always outreach, getting people together to talk about astronomy. He actually did some real research. Him and David Dunham was working for JPL at the time. He was organizing what was called grazing occultations.
The IOTA organization?
Right. Well, David formed IOTA in the mid-'60s eventually. The idea was the moon passes in front of a star. If it just grazes along the limb, it passes in front of mountain peaks, or behind mountain peaks rather, and then you can see the starlight through valleys and things like that. And if you have a line of telescopes perpendicular to this path projected onto the Earth, you can then trace out the limb of the moon, these mountains and valleys. And you go, well, why is that important? Well, two reasons. We did not have a good idea as to what the limb of the moon looked like, first of all, and this was very useful information for this little program called Apollo that was up and going at the time.
I think I've heard of that.
Because as it turns out, they were interested in knowing what the geography on the moon looked like. And as it also turns out, we didn't really have a super good idea of what the moon's orbit looked like. So This grazing occultations really helped refine the moon's orbit so that they kind of knew when to turn the engines off on this spacecraft as they were coming into orbit.
Yeah, interesting.
So the Riverside Astronomical Society, under Cliff Holmes, did about 36 of these. And successfully saw it probably about half the time, without being clouded out and stuff. And all this information was submitted to NASA and all that.
Wow.
So yeah, Cliff loved the science side too, and in particular loved comets.
That's like the first pro-am collaboration.
Right. Yeah, and Cliff loved solar eclipses. He'd go to every one that he could get to.
Fantastic. Now, he ran it. How long did he run the RTMC?
Cliff ran it up till 1991 when he stepped down as executive director.
Okay.
And I'm working from memory, but I believe that to be accurate, at least within a year. Okay. And then Cliff passed away in 1993.
Right.
And Steve Edberg, ran it from, I believe, 1992 up till about a couple of years ago as executive director.
Now, it's called the Riverside Telescope Makers Conference.
Okay.
How did that focus come to be?
Okay. Well, when it first started, it was just kind of the Telescope Conference, or that Riverside Convention, or that West Coast Convention, or whatever. It's hard to tell when the name actually gelled to become the Riverside Telescope Makers Conference, but not before 73, and probably not before 71 or 2. Now, it was called the Riverside Telescope Makers Conference, and of course we always shorten things up to become acronyms, which is not really an acronym, because an acronym you have to be able to pronounce. It's really just initials. So it became the RTMC, and it was the RTMC up until 1989 when it was spun off into a separate organization, at which point in time it became the Riverside Telescope Makers Conference, Inc. Okay. And then it was called the RTMC in the popular literature in elsewhere up until, about the year 2000 or so. And we were trying to expand the focus, and, because telescope making by then, with commercial enterprises coming along, you could buy a much better telescope, much cheaper than you could ever build it for. More people coming to the conference were interested in astronomy, what you do with it, astrophotography, all the things about astronomy. So we were trying to take the focus a little bit off of just telescope making, because we kept going, if I'm not into building telescopes, I don't need to go to that conference. So the name of the conference itself officially became the RTMC Astronomy Expo. And that was used that way for many years, but I noticed that people kind of stopped using that name, and it's just back to the RTMC again, and most people don't even know what TCM stands for anymore.
That's funny. Now, the attendance over the years, like the early years, how many people would attend?
Well, in the early years, the first one was 130 people. Then it got up to
That's good for a first-year conference.
Yeah, got up to about 200, and finally 240 at the last one at RCC in 1972. When they moved up to the mountains in San Jacinto Mountains, it dropped down to about 200. Then they moved over to Big Bear, and it was 200 in Big Bear. That's when it really started taking off, because all throughout all these years, Sky and Telescope would write an article about it every year. Then Astronomy Magazine started writing articles about it in the mid-'80s. And then there was this other telescope called Telescope Making Magazine that was, a subsidiary of one of those two. And so there was always like 3 articles a year. And so the population grew from 200 to 300 to 500 to 600. By the end of the 70s, it was up to 800 at the early 80s. Then it grew to 1,000, and eventually stabilized at around 1,500 throughout the 80s.
Yeah, my first year was 77, and I went every year after that for quite a number of years, and just seeing it grow was amazing.
Yeah, then there was kind of a change. Vendors were starting to come in that period of time. And the largest year was actually 1987. I believe Clyde Tombaugh was here, and a couple of others. And the numbers are a bit disputed, but it's either 24 or 2,600. Whatever. What's undisputed was everybody agrees there's way too many people for a camp of this size. And so nobody was pushing to have the crowd be getting that great anymore. It once touched 2,000 again in the year 1990. But most years it was in the 16 to 1,800 range, which was fairly comfortable. Well, not really, because there wasn't place enough to park all the cars after a while.
Oh, I remember those days. Yeah, trying to come. If you showed up on Saturday, you couldn't park.
Yeah, just the line to get in at 9 o'clock Friday morning was over a mile long, all the way to the pavement. It was really an issue and requiring a dozen people just to direct traffic. Nowadays is much more comfortable. The population, I don't know the exact numbers these days, but it's dropped, well under 1,000, as have all star parties.
Right.
Which is, we could talk for hours about the evolution of amateur astronomy in the country, in the world, what's happened, the evolution of all hobbies, as a matter of fact, the effect of society, the effect of the internet, the effect of all these sorts of things. Diversification means that the Super Bowl doesn't attract as many viewers anymore.
Right.
American Idol doesn't attract as many viewers anymore. Well, there's very good reasons for it. Cable cutting,
Right.
all this stuff is, all this stuff is affecting how events like this are put on and what kind of events are given to people. It's an interesting societal problem.
Yeah, and how to bring in younger people. That's one thing we're struggling with in the ALPO, too, is like we started a podcast. This podcast to reach younger people, and it's working somewhat. The numbers are still out there, but it seems to be working. I want to jump back to 1987, though.
Okay.
That was the biggest year. We also had Halley's Comet in that time period,
right, yeah.
And all the telescope vendors were pumping out telescopes. So it's supply and demand.
You look at membership numbers of amateur astronomy organizations, they all peaked right after Halley's Comet. They all peaked right after Apollo, too, for the same reasons. Right. And they all tailed off again. So it's interesting, what attracts attention, what gets attention, what captures people's imagination. Then the question is, how do you hold that attention?
How do you keep them? That's true. Yeah, and over the years, I've seen the evolution here of the people, but it's also, I gave a talk yesterday, and I recognized like half of them, but last time I saw them 20 years ago, they all had brown and black hair. Now we've all got the gray hair going on. It's like
Yeah, I mean, and I've talked to all the editors of Sky and Telescope and elsewhere about these issues and what the things that they're trying to do. And Sky and Telescope is at least really happy that they've maintained their subscription base where everybody else has really dropped down.
Wow.
So they're pleased from that perspective, but not pleased, on the relationship to all of this throughout society. These discussions go on everywhere about what attracts a millennial. How do you get to them? How do you get their interest, off the smartphone and away from the video game? How can you leverage all of that? Well, you've got to get onto the smartphone apparently in front of them.
You do.
Something that you're trying. But they also got to feel like they're contributing to something and something important. The citizen science movement is one of the growing movements out there. I'm heavily involved in that. But how do you, after you get them involved, how do you keep them involved, particularly when life catches up to them and they have families and things drag their attention away? And how do you plant the seed and wait for them when now they're, the kids are in high school and they got time on their hands, or they become empty nesters and have a little bit of money, disposable income and stuff. How do you place yourself to be in the right place at the right time?
It's $1 million question right there for every hobby, basically.
Yeah.
Let's talk about vendors, the evolution of vendors. When did they start showing up?
The first vendors have been here from day one, but the first vendor that showed up to actually sell something was in 1978, I believe.
Okay.
Might be off by a year, one year on either way. It was Celestron Telescope. They set up literally a banquet table, looks to be a 10-foot banquet table, out on the edge of the telescope field, because they had some seconds. What we mean by seconds is these were marred goods, an eyepiece with a scratch on it, for instance, that they can't sell as new. or there was stuff that was returned for whatever reason that they cannot sell as new. So they needed to have a place to sell this stuff. So they got the bright idea, oh, let's just take it up and heavily discount it and people come and buy this stuff. So they did, and it took all of 10 minutes, I think, and other vendors took note of this, oh, there's an idea. Let's do that. 50% is still better than nothing.
That's true.
So Meade and everybody else started doing it, and then they started realizing we don't need to just sell seconds and used stuff. We can sell anything. So throughout the early 80s and so, the telescope manufacturers started bringing up, brand new telescopes. Starlight Instruments with their beautiful Dobbs would set up like, here's one of each. Please come and use them at night. See what you can see. Celestron Meade, here's our new line of telescopes. We'll have one of each out here. Please come use them at night. The CCD camera manufacturers started coming. Everybody started doing this as product demos. They'd find that the magazine articles would actually write about them. Free publicity. And it just kind of ballooned, and this whole, throughout all of the country, throughout all of business, this was really the era of the rise of the trade show. When, you could go, the Anaheim Convention Center, where the RV manufacturers have rented out the whole thing. It's the same idea on a much larger scale.
That's very true.
We didn't invent this. Celestron didn't invent this. It all just kind of happened at the same time.
The byproduct of the conference.
Right. And this was a time before the internet, before you could buy stuff. So mail order existed. You may buy stuff by mail order, but stuff was not heavily competing against each other on price.
And they're not putting their factory seconds. I remember one year I picked up a brass 90mm refractor from Meade for $150, and I'm like, it was all brass, and amazing. It had a little dent in the dew cap.
The first C8, was $1,200. My first C8, I want to remember, was right around $2,000, and a C8 today is well under $1,000. Price competition plus efficiencies in manufacturing and all sorts of reasons for that. It brought telescopes to within the price point where people could afford them, but the competition also got very fierce. I'm mentioning this because this has affected what the vendors can do. The vendors peaked about the year 2005, 6, or 7 for us with elaborate vendor displays and everything. But I'm going to tell you, the vendors are losing money doing this. When Meade showed up with 20 employees in tow that they were paying overtime to, maybe double time for holiday weekends, and when you looked at Meade's financial statements, because they were a public company, and yes, I did look.
That's true.
Meade was losing money. Celestron was losing money. Celestron tried to buy Meade at that time, and the FDA the FCC stepped in and said, "Oh no, you can't."
Right.
So all these guys suddenly found that their marketing budgets were being slashed just due to sheer economic reasons. The internet was starting to come along, and suddenly they didn't have the marketing budgets available anymore to go to trade shows. Plus, coming to a place up here in the mountains where it was an hour and a half, 2-hour drive from the nearest airport and stuff like that. These are all problematic things.
You got to transport all the equipment up here and maintain.
Yeah, trade shows still occur, but now they're limited to 2 or 3.
Yeah, NEAF is like the big one.
NEAF is the big, and I just got back from NEAF, and it's fabulous. There's one down in Texas. And they go often to like the astroimaging places, and they go to the astroimaging workshops. There's one in the East Coast, one on the West Coast, because these are the people with money,
right?
Honestly. If you are a top-notch astroimager, you have in your rig the price of a brand new luxury car. And so
the mount alone.
In the mount alone. And maybe, depending upon your luxury car of choice, you might have $100,000 in your rig. Easy. If you own an observatory, maybe more than that. These are people that can be marketed to that don't hesitate to spend $500 on something that will improve their efficiency and throughput. So the manufacturers now go to trade shows marketing to these people. They don't go to trade shows by and large anymore where somebody's looking for a $50 Telrad or something like that, or a $25 flashlight.
Right.
The sheer economics keep them away. And now the star parties are competing with all the national parks who want to put on star parties for their visitors. Of course, it's a natural fit. But, you have your choice each and every summer of at least two dozen wonderful star parties that you can go to. But as a result, all of them have a lower attendance because you can only go to so many of these
That's very true. Now, let's talk about telescopes.
Okay.
The different types of telescopes you've seen over the years. Has there been an evolution of telescopes?
An evolution, yes. The basic concept has been there since, Isaac Newton, right?
Understand that.
Yeah, but, as to what, when I first started in 1974, I would drool over the ads in the back of Sky and Telescope, and there would be, the Unitron ads, and I knew I had to have that refractor somehow. Never got that refractor somehow. The Questar ad, I would kill for a Questar. No, I never got a Questar. Edmund Scientific was more what I could afford as a young college student. So, I bought and assembled the telescope and put it on their $200 mount that I somehow scraped together the money for. And that was my first telescope. And then I built everything because at the time I could build a telescope for much better than I could buy for far less money.
Right.
So, hence, Telescope Making Conference was really taken off at that point because they were teaching all the techniques and the things to look for and are you going to be into taking pictures? Are you into looking? Do you want a Dobsonian light bucket? In which case, how do you build that? How do you improve upon his original design? Or are you doing something different? Are you into planetary? All these are issues. Eyepieces. What eyepieces do you need? So all of this was very important. So people were really into building stuff. Now, over the course of about 20 years, and really 10 or 15 years, the manufacturers got caught up. They developed their techniques. They got the price points down to where people could afford things. And now, from the mid-'80s on, you could buy a better telescope far cheaper than you could hope to build yourself.
But there's satisfaction in making it yourself, too.
Right.
And it's comforting to see you get merit awards at the conference for home-built telescopes.
Yeah.
And it's comforting for me to see, after not being here for a few years, that you still have a lot of awards that you're giving away, and that telescopes are amazing.
Right. So the question is, what's important to you, the amateur astronomer? Is it the journey, or is it the destination? And if it's the destination, you're going to probably purchase a commercial telescope. If it's the journey, you might build it yourself, use it a couple times, and then start on the next telescope.
And that's what you see, because a lot of times you'll see repeat people win merit awards year after year, or they might miss a year as they're working on their new project.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, yes, people still build their own custom cars.
Mm-hmm.
People build their own custom airplanes from time to time.
True.
And that is what the hobby is for them. Other people want to drive places and fly places.
Right. Very true.
Yeah.
Now, the attendance this year is down. Why do you think that occurred?
Well, the attendance for the past several years, and since I've not been involved in running it for the past 4 or 5 years, I'm only hearing this secondhand.
Okay.
But through the mid 2000s, the attendance was fairly stable at around 1,700, give or take. Might be 1,600 or 1,800, depends upon the phase of the moon. I always noted that a new moon would get you to an extra 200 people.
Okay, so it's the people that want to come up here and observe, because it is a fairly dark sky site.
Yes.
Yeah.
So along comes 2007, most notable in the economic world as the official start of the Great Recession.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But that's not the only thing that was going on in the world that year. There was a whole bunch of other things. Gas prices kind of were peaking about then, and up through the year 2000s, you you would sometimes have to turn sideways to squeeze between all the giant RVs that were coming up here. That was the huge popular thing. People driving around these big, 30-foot motorhomes or fifth wheels or whatever. Well, a lot of those people started thinking about that when gas prices hit $4 a gallon. Great Recession, issues in the internet is quite possibly one of the most significant issues. Up till about then, you came to conferences to acquire information,
right?
To rub elbows with people, ask them how they're doing things, observe how they're doing things, go to workshops, go to attend talks and things like that. Bottom line, that was your primary source of information: listening to people and asking people.
But it's also the friendships.
Yes.
I mean, like I said, it's been years since I've been up here, and I'm walking around and I'm meeting people I knew years ago and striking up those friendships and conversations again. And now we're exchanging email addresses or Twitter handles.
Yeah, the internet is caught up in that. People usually by now, they don't have to wait till May to find out how to do something. They've already learned how to do something off of a Google search or off of a website or a YouTube video. If you need to find out how to collimate the mirror on your telescope, there are 50 YouTube videos out there that'll show you how. You do not need to attend a talk to find out how.
Very true.
So, so all of these little motivations for coming to events like this are being ticked off one at a time. So, but the most important singular one is the friendships, the people that you learn and got to meet over the years, and sometimes this is the only time you actually get to see them once a year. So that's been the primary motivation of all the other little things that came along the way that still remains and will always remain, because internet friendships are fine and well and good. Being Facebook friends with somebody is great, and catching up and seeing what they're doing, but that only takes you so far.
That's true.
Okay.
That's true. So you've held it at Camp Oaks for 25 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, 45 years.
45 years at Camp Oaks, okay. So you're still going to carry on the Camp Oaks, but something's changing with the date?
Okay. I was told by the board of directors, member of the board of directors, that Camp Oaks, who apparently is in a major remodel right now, just look around and see all the grading going on for laying out of new dorms and things like that.
There's a cell tower out there now.
There's a cell tower out there, yep.
Looks like a tree.
That the Camp Oaks wants to use, they got a special event in mind on Memorial Day weekend, and the Camp Oaks is owned by the YMCA of Greater Long Beach, of all people, and has owned it since the late 50s when the camp was built. And it was built as a for-purpose campground to service the underprivileged youth of the Greater Long Beach community. And they have all year long, kids come up for camps, and they stay in this is not a camping facility. This is where they come up and stay in the dorms. And every weekend, every week they're shuffling through a new group of kids all year long. Well, they apparently have some kind of event in line for Memorial Day weekend that they want to use it for. I'm not clear what it is, but it's something important enough where they need the whole camp. So they informed the board of the RTMC that Memorial Day weekend is not going to be available to them in the future, but would like to make other arrangements for another time. So they've been talking about it, and they apparently they've arranged on a date in 2019 that's in the month of September.
I heard the third weekend.
The third weekend of September. Now, the Memorial Day weekend, it's had its pluses and minuses. With the exception of one experiment, since the 1970s, it's always been held on that weekend, come hell or high water.
Full moon, new moon, doesn't matter.
Full moon, new moon, blizzard, whatever, we're holding
Blizzards.
it here. Yes, blizzards, plural.
I've been here for a few.
Yeah, but, apparently Labor Day weekend was not available for this. I don't know whether to term it the grand experiment or the set in stone or whatever it is. Memorial Day weekend has had its plus and minuses. The weather is usually fairly pleasant, but you can always have the late storm.
You're not going to have that in September.
You're not going to have that in September. It is possible to get a storm blowing through in September, but it's really rare.
Not like now.
Yeah. So there's going to be a few pluses to holding it in September from that idea, and it'll be very interesting to see how this all works out.
Okay. You're not on the board anymore, but do you have any idea how they're going to handle the change of date with people and press?
I don't know, and I don't know that they know at this point in time. Obviously, this is going to be a big communication move for them. Back when I was involved, we still mailed stuff. There was this thing called the U.S. mail and a first-class postage stamp, and we would mail out a printed piece of paper invite, basically. Actually, it was several pieces of paper.
I think I got one this year.
Yeah.
Still.
And, explaining all the wonderful things that were going to happen to each and every person who attended in the prior 4 years. Okay. And but over time, that got kind of pricey to do. And so they went with internet only, which is what most people are doing nowadays. Mm-hmm. And that has a good and bad effect to it. The good is it's very economical to do it. The bad is, it's hard to get people's attention. On the other hand, I know what happens in my mailbox.
Right.
Between the mailbox and the back door is this blue bin called the recycle bin. And only one piece of paper out of 10 actually makes it into my house anymore. So I'm not sure how effective first-class mailing would be in the future.
Oh, okay. So speak to the people that have never been, and tell them to come next year.
All right. Well, to the people that have never been, this is your chance to rub elbows with some of the greatest amateur astronomers on the planet. I looked around this weekend and I saw, some of the household names that you read about each and every year. On stage last night was 4 amateur astronomers that between the 4 of them had discovered or co-discovered 49 comets. Yes, 4 followed by a 9. That was David Levy, Gene Mueller, Alan Hale, and Thomas Mockles. Don Mockles. And, those 4 are worth the price of admission right there. And each and every one of them, you just walk up and strike a conversation, and they will take you by the elbow and walk you aside and talk your ear off.
Yeah. That all of them are very, very approachable. And
everybody up here is very approachable. We have the stereotype of the typical nerdish type of person who's attracted to the sciences, and absolutely those people are out there. But
we're talking about you, right?
Yeah.
No, not Bob, but you, who's listening.
You, the listening public. We're talking about you, but you really have it in you to be a social animal when you're paired up to be the next person with just like you. Suddenly you have all sorts of things of common interest, and you strike up lifetime friendships.
Yep.
I have friendships going back 45 years from this club and organization and other organizations I've been on. When I look at my Facebook friends, I notice that 3/4 of them are astronomy related.
That's very true.
So when you think in terms of, I'm shy. I'm a shy person. Oh, I can't do that. I don't make friends easily. Well, if you don't make friends easily, this is the place for you. Exactly the place for you, where you come and do make friends easily. And it's amazing the number of friends you will walk away with from a single weekend.
Yeah. You don't have to be a telescope maker to attend.
No, you don't.
You don't have to bring a telescope. There are hundreds of telescopes. You could spend the entire night walking around the field looking through 16-inch Dobbs or 7-inch Takahashi refractors, and they're all out there.
I have not brought a telescope for decades myself. I am perfectly content to walk from telescope to telescope and walk up and go, oh, what are you looking at? Oh, it looks like your telescope happens to be pointed at the Ring Nebula up there. It's in that general area of the sky. Is that what you're looking at? Right. Tell me about your telescope. Every single one of these people, you simply ask, what are you looking at? And they strike up a conversation because they're proud of what they want to tell you about their telescope and what they're looking at. They can't wait to share it with you, as a matter of fact.
That's very true. And you also have, recently you've gotten into astroimaging.
Yes.
You have I don't want to call it a competition, but you have something like that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. Astroimaging, I have not recently gotten into astroimaging. I took my first astro picture about 48 hours after I identified with myself as an amateur astronomer. Now, a couple of those pictures I still have. Sadly, most of them will never be shown to the public again. Okay?
Mine are on negative somewhere.
Well, I have scanned mine, and some of them might make it in as a joke picture from time to time. But I got heavily involved in astroimaging back in the fun days when we were cooking our film in ovens to try to get more performance, and then pressure cooking them in a mixture of hydrogen and nitrogen gas, and then freezing the film, and then, developing negative slides as positives, and vice versa. Any trick in the book, Bottom line is, I got burnt out on all of that, and I quickly became a visual observer to go look at variable stars for a few years.
There you go.
So, nonetheless, then this magical product called a CCD camera came along, a charge-coupled device. Just think of it as the chip that's in your smartphone that you're holding in your hand right now, a very advanced form of what we had back in the day. And going, oh, neat, look, professional astronomers are using this to do real work. And, oh, hey, we can do some really pretty pictures with this stuff. And this has grown up to be the art form. And I emphasize the word art, A-R-T. Amateur astronomers are artists. If you're an astro-imager, you are no different than the person who sits down with a canvas and paint and a brush. You are the Picasso of your age, and you are interpreting what you see in the night sky and trying to explain it to the person you're showing as to what this object is and why you are interested in it. What attracted you to look at this object, and why should they be interested? Is it a field of lilies, or is it a cloud of glowing hydrogen gas in the sky surrounding a cluster of stars just being born? This is what you're trying to interpret and explain to your family, friends, and the public. So this has really caught on to be as quite the activity in recent years. And you can very easily, with a starter camera and simply no more than a tripod, interpret this for the public. I'm holding in my hand a 1-pound mirrorless camera that cost me $600. I'm holding in my other hand a small tabletop tripod, and in both of these I took pictures 2 nights ago of the stars circling around the North Star Polaris, illustrating the rotation of the Earth and the star party that was going on underneath this activity. It was very simple. I could have done it with a cheaper camera. I just happen to, use the camera I like. Yep. And you can do that too with very little skill and downloading a free program from the internet to stitch it all together into one image. It was a piece of cake. It literally took me 10 minutes to put the image together, and it was mostly sitting there watching the computer do it.
Yeah, that's the fun part, watching the computer be the artist.
Right. Yeah. Now, obviously, you can get a lot more elaborate with that concept. But I like to chase solar eclipses, which is you can take a picture with your smartphone, you can take a picture with your point-and-shoot camera, you can take a picture of video, or you can use some very expensive rigs to do some sophisticated things. But you know what? They all look very pretty. And so, recognition that most amateur astronomers like to do this at some level or another. And there's been pictures all over the place, and you see them. It's hard to avoid them these days. We decided to hold a little contest up here. It's our astro-imaging contest, and we started it about 12 years or so ago. And the idea was, hey, everybody just bring a picture, and we'll divide it into about 5 categories. Here's our pictures of eclipses. Here's pictures of deep sky objects. Here's solar system objects like planets and things like that. And here's your general category, which may be your nightscape objects, the moon rising over that bluff, or over the cactus or whatever out there, which is a very, very easy picture to take. So people bring up pictures. Then everybody comes by and votes on them, and we have a little contest, and it's all well and fun and so on.
That's good. And there's also an area set up for beginners, the beginner's corner.
We found that to be very popular. It was actually started about 20 years ago. And the problem is, of course, all of this seems very intimidating to people who've not seen any of this before. All these decisions made, and if you make a mistake, it could be a wrong, it could be an expensive wrong decision, and so on and so forth. So we organize what's called the Beginner's Corner. The camp up here has the big main meeting room, and it has a small annex off to the side, and then there's a whole other building that's got, this lobby area and a meeting room that can hold about 100 or so people. So we decided to hold the beginners' corners in there with a parallel program aimed at just beginners. Okay, here's a 45-minute talk on how to pick a telescope. Here's a 45-minute talk on how to pick eyepieces. Here's a 45-minute talk on how to pick a camera for astrophotography, if you so desire.
These are pretty well attended.
I poked my head in there, and there was easily 30 people attending the classroom, the talk on how to pick eyepieces.
Okay.
Yeah, which, was about a quarter of the people attending whatever talk was going on in the main meeting hall.
Wow!
So it is very popular stuff, and you could spend the whole conference just attending the beginners' corner, and then we take a break, and Ken Braun, he says, okay, let's go do the solar system walk, where we, the typical, we've laid out the planets to scale, and we're going to walk from Mercury to Venus to the Earth and on, and we're going to talk, and he's going to talk about all the planets. So he's going to explain the solar system, and if you brought your kids up, they may get a better idea of how the solar system laid out than they do in their science class in the 4th grade.
Good point.
Thanks to Ken's, activity there. And then Ken comes out at night and says, okay, everybody, we're going to gather over here at the chapel where we have some nice seating here, and it's away from the crowd, and I'm going to get my laser pointer out, and I'm going to give you a constellation walk. I'm going to show you, here's the Big Dipper, here's the constellation of Hercules, here's the constellation of Cygnus, here's where all the good objects are, so on and so forth. Let's talk a little bit about mythology. Oh, this star Vega up here. Well, remember the Jodie Foster film Contact? That's where she flew. All that sort of stuff. So we, if you're wanting to get into the hobby, again, this is the place to come.
And this is also a good family location because it is a youth camp.
Yes.
And it's in Big Bear.
Right.
So there's things, if you have a spouse that's not into astronomy, there's lots of shopping, lots of nice restaurants in town.
Yeah.
But there's a swimming pool here. There's all sorts of things.
Hang on to the credit card. Don't let her walk out the door with the credit card. You may regret that decision. But for the kids, there's a zip line that goes to. It starts on the island on the lake and then goes, off. There's a climbing wall. There's an archery place.
Kayaks.
Kayaks. Yeah, there's kayaks out on the lake. Sadly, got to report, the horses are gone.
That's
you
very
can
sad.
no longer do horseback riding.
I'm friends with Scott and Sherry, who used to run the horses.
But you can do mountain biking.
Yeah.
You can do hiking. Yeah, you can, there's just no end of things that a family activity. This is actually cheaper than paying to go to a public campground at a national park. The registration fees to bring your family here are cheaper than going to a national park.
That's true.
And you will have a whole lot more fun and activity.
And there's food available here and everything.
Yes.
It's reason I got a spaghetti dinner last night for $8.
$8.
I mean, it was really good.
Uh-huh.
But I just thought of another advantage for having it held in September: the traffic.
Yes.
It took me 4 hours to get here. I'm 150 miles away.
Yes.
It took me 4 hours, and on September, it's not a holiday weekend.
Yeah.
It's an easier drive coming up the hill.
Exactly.
So that's
that
might get me up next year.
Since I was running it for so often, I was usually coming up on Thursday before, so I never got to see that and appreciate it. But I am fully aware of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another one. Well, I wish RTMC a lot of luck in the future. What can you tell us about what you're working on now outside of the organization?
Okay, well, I'll give you a brief commercial because I'm sure that you're going to want to save this for a new and different, for something completely different broadcast. I mentioned the fact that, I always enjoyed the science and things. And after I got burnt out on astrophotography for the first time, I got into the science, AAVSO, looking at variable stars, and, did a number of different things along the way. But I fell in with a bad crowd of astronomers. They're the planetary scientists.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yes. Those guys, they run in bad circles, and they drug me in kicking and screaming. I now work on asteroids, on characterizing the physical properties of asteroids, of what's going on out there, how fast they rotate, what are they shaped like, do they have moons and things. I've discovered some asteroids along the way, and had all sorts of great times, rubbing elbows with the professional community, going to their conferences, giving talks and stuff, knowing that I'm the dumbest person in the room. It takes, I've never appreciated the fact that I can just go up there knowing I'm the dumbest person in the room and talk out loud.
Yeah.
But I've realized, looking back upon my youth, I used to do that when I was a teenager, when I told my first boss that, no, I wasn't going to put flyers on the windshield wipers of the cars in the parking lot, because I hated it when people did that to me. And he nodded his head and says, okay, I see your point. So I guess I was always like this. I never understood it. But nonetheless, you and I have a built-in advantage to these professional astronomers in that we don't have to go begging for money.
That's true.
Okay.
They want our data.
The professional astronomer literally spends 60 or more % of his time, or her time, let me put that her in there, very important, begging for money. And realistically, only 10% of their time actually doing the work.
Right.
We get to do the work, and we get the accolades.
That's true.
So if you ever want to talk to me about how this is done, and can the amateur astronomer do it, and will the data actually be appreciated and wanted, the answer is absolutely yes, yes, and yes.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Well, Bob, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast today.
All righty. And you and I will see each other again in 3 weeks at one of these conferences that I just described.
SAS. All right. We'll see you there.
Okay.
Well, that'll do it for this episode of the Observer's Notebook Podcast. I really want to thank Bob Stevens for coming on again to be our special guest and talk about RTMC. This is a conference that I think if you're in the area, or even if you want to travel out to Southern California and enjoy the high mountains of San Bernardino County, and go to Big Bear, it's a beautiful site. Come on up September 2019 and enjoy the Riverside Telescope Makers Conference. We upload a new episode of the podcast every few weeks. You can subscribe to us on iTunes. If you do, please rate and review us. I really appreciate it. You can now listen on iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Google Play, Stitcher, and Amazon Echo. You can support the podcast by donating to it via Patreon. If you give up to $35 a month, you receive 1 year's membership to the ALPO and producer credits on the podcast. And with that, I really want to thank the producer of this podcast, Steve Siedentop, for his generous continued support of the Observer's Notebook. Thank you very much, Steve. A link for Patreon as well as a link for the ALPO is in the show notes. If you'd like to drop me a line, you can email me at cometman@cometman.net or on Twitter at observersnbpod. If you want to join the ALPO, membership begins at only $14 a year. Yeah, that's right, $14 a year. You can find out more at www.alpo-astronomy.org. You can find the ALPO on Facebook by searching ALPO Astronomy, and also you can find the Facebook page of the podcast. Just search for Observer's Notebook. And until next time, my hope is that you always have clear and steady skies. Thanks for listening.